Hello, everybody, and welcome to Digital Hammurabi. I am your host, Megan Lewis, and today I am joined by Dr. Solange Ashby, which is very exciting. Dr. Ashby received her PhD in Egyptology from the University of Chicago with a specialization in ancient Egyptian language and religion. Her dissertation explores the prayer inscriptions of Nubian groups that traveled to the Egyptian temples of Lower Nubia, including the Temple of Philae. This research has been published in her first book, Calling Out to Isis, the enduring Nubian presence as Philae, and will also be the main topic of today's discussion. So Dr. Ashby, welcome to Digital Hammurabi, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Would you, to begin with, give us a little bit of information about your particular specialization and how you got into the field?
Yes. So I'm trained as an Egyptologist, meaning that I've studied all phases of the Egyptian language and the four scripts associated with that. Hieroglyphs, hieratic, demotic, and Coptic. And I've specialized in demotic, I think the ugliest of those scripts, but we can talk about that later. I got into the field, I think as a nerdy teenager reading Greek mythology. And then I started reading about Alexander of Macedon and his conquest of Egypt. And that was my first introduction to ancient Egypt. So fast forward many years until I was living in Oakland, California, and I was able to start taking courses at UC Berkeley through their adult education program, which I'm so grateful that that was available to me. I started off doing a general history class of ancient Egypt with Dr. Teresa Moore at Berkeley. And then we sort of twisted her arm to offer us a Middle Egyptian language class in which we got to study hieroglyphs and the classical language of ancient Egypt. And I was just hooked. Yeah.
Wonderful. I want to say surprisingly common, but it's probably not surprising how many people kind of get into the ancient world through Greek mythology.
Yeah.
I asked this question of every guest, and several people said, and it happened to me too. It's why I'm here, because of Greek myth.
Great stories, and so much more widely available than, for example, Egyptian mythology.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Could you talk very briefly about the differences between all of the different Egyptian scripts, because that kind of comes up quite a bit in your research?
Sure. So hieroglyphs have been used since the beginning of Egyptian history. They're developed around 3200 BCE. And used to write monumental texts, so texts that decorate temple walls, priestly decrees, royal stelae. The equivalent, and developed shortly thereafter, is called hieratic. That's a more cursive form, but still writing the same hieroglyphs. And this was used by the priests to write texts on papyrus. So then we have to fast forward thousands of years till the 7th century BCE, when another script called demotic was invented. Much uglier. It kind of looked like chicken scratch, written from right to left. And it was developed as a business hand. So to write legal documents, marriage contracts, lending documents. And in the late period, so 1st, 2nd, 3rd century CE, when the Egyptian priests stopped being able to write and read the hieroglyphic text that had traditionally, or hieroglyphic script that had traditionally been used to write religious text, they turned then to the demotic, which was more commonly known. And so we start to have religious texts written in demotic. Mm-hmm. And then finally, there's Coptic, which of course uses the Greek alphabet and a couple more letters to capture Egyptian sounds not present in Greek. But that writing system, that phase of the language, is much more closely associated with Egyptian Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So your book, Calling Out to Isis, and your dissertation research looks specifically at the evidence of Nubian activity at the temple to Isis in Philae or Philae? I've been saying it wrong. Philae, there we go. Can you just tell us a little bit about the location and significance of the temple and the time period that this interaction occurred in?
Yeah, sure. So the temple is located on an island at a gorgeous site in the middle of the Nile at the first cataract, which has been considered the traditional boundary between Egypt to the north and Nubia to the south. The temple as it stands right now, I should say it's a temple complex. So the main temple dedicated to the goddess Isis as it stands now was built under Ptolemy II around 260 BCE. This temple faces south towards Nubia, which is interesting because many, if not most, Egyptian temples faced east towards the rising sun. So it clearly was built with an interaction with Nubia in mind. There are several subsidiary temples, a string of smaller temples in the forecourt associated with Nubian deities, Mondelez and Ahrens-Nufis, for example. And then to the east of the main temple is a small temple dedicated to the goddess Hathor. So it really is a temple complex, very much Ptolemaic and Roman period construction. But I love to point out that there is evidence of earlier construction on the island all the way back to the Kushite king Taharqa. So we have a granite bark stand of his standing in the second courtyard in front of the main temple. And when they had to dismantle and move this temple to save it from the flooding of Lake Nasser, they discovered under the Ptolemaic temple blocks dedicated by Taharqa, where he's shown worshiping the god Amun. So there's a long history at this sacred site.
That's fantastic. The temples or the structures dedicated to Nubian deities, were they built by Ptolemy?
The Temple of Ahrens-Nufis, there are several rooms. It's quite small, but there are still several rooms, one of which was built, I believe, under Ptolemy IV, probably just shortly before this Theban revolt, when Upper Egyptian people threw off Ptolemaic rule and became independent for a short period, 20 years. And during this period, it seems that Meroitic kings came to Philae and undertook construction. So part of this Temple of Ahrens-Nufis was constructed under Archimani II, who was a Kushite ruler. And I'll use Kushite and Meroitic interchangeably.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So do we know why... I'm going to say it wrong again. Philae?
Yes. Yes.
Why Philae was an important religious site for Nubians, and what other religious locations do we see Nubian activity in?
I believe that it was important, certainly going back before the time of Taharqa, who ruled in the 7th century BCE. I believe that, well, first of all, I should just say that the Temple of Philae is situated in Nubia. It is south of the first cataract, so technically it is in Nubia. Mm-hmm. And it has an extended period of Nubian presence at this sacred site. I believe, and I've not written a lot about this in my book, but I believe that the first Nubians were coming to the adjacent island called Biga now, but Senmet in Egyptian, because this was a sacred site for the goddess Hathor. And I suggests that this was the original draw for Nubians to come to this sacred site. Their association with and worship of the goddess Hathor goes back so much longer than this Nubian reverence for the goddess Isis and the god Osiris. I should add also, Megan, perhaps the trouble with pronouncing Philae comes from the fact that it's not even a Greek word. As with so much from our understanding of Egypt, we're seeing Egyptian words filtered through Greek. So this is how the Greeks rendered the Egyptian name Pa-iulek, which means the island at the extremity or the island of time. And even that etymology doesn't make sense because it's been suggested recently that these were the Egyptians trying to capture a Nubian name for this site.
That's really interesting.
Right. So it's third hand that we're getting this name. So it's no wonder that we're like, how do you say this?
How do we say this?
Yeah.
So you, in your book, you look specifically at a set of Nubian prayer inscriptions and associated graffito. Whereabouts in the temple complex were these inscriptions found, and what do they typically consist of?
So this is a really good question. I identified 3 separate phases of Nubian presence at Philae. So first in the 1st century CE under early Roman control, and then much more dramatically in the mid-3rd century CE with representatives of Meroitic kings coming as priests to undertake rites and at a certain point actually physically controlling the temple. And then this very late period in the first half of the 5th century CE when the temple was kind of in its death throes and priests were coming sponsored by Blemmie kings. So that's a lot. I'm going to focus today really on this second phase where we have Meroitic royal patronage of Nubian priests, so from Lower Nubia, who are coming to perform rites at Philae on behalf of their royal sponsors in Meroe. So most of their inscriptions are located on the western side of the temple complex. And it's interesting that the decoration at Philae is divided between Isis, the mother, as associated with Hathor on the east side of the temple complex. And then on the west side, Isis as the spouse and principal mourner of her deceased husband, Osiris. And that theology, that ritual, the rites performed for this deceased god, Osiris, is precisely what drew these Nubian priests to come and take part in something called the Feast of Entry, that is a procession that takes the sacred statue of Isis through a gate, the Gate of Hadrian, located on the west of the main temple, down to a dock, onto a boat, and over to the nearby island of Biga that I mentioned earlier, that had become associated with the burial of Osiris. And so they're going with this divine statue over to this mortuary complex of Osiris to pour libations as part of rites to revivify this slain god. And I propose, and others have before me, that this is associated with rites performed in Meroe in the royal funerary chapels of Meroitic kings and queens. These same rites would have been performed for deceased rulers in Meroe.
Fascinating. So you kind of have the rites for Osiris being echoed in actual funerary rites for dead kings.
Certainly, yeah.
That's fascinating. So going back for a minute to the languages that we spoke about earlier, which of these languages were used for the inscriptions? And can we use that differing language use to understand anything about the political situation at the temple?
Yes, so the inscriptions were written in three languages, Demotic, Egyptian, first and foremost. Something like a half or perhaps even more of the inscriptions were written in Egyptian Demotic. Then Meroitic. The Meroitic language is used for inscriptions. And then finally, Greek. And so each language says a bit about what the inscriber was intending to do there. These Nubian priests were triliteral, which I like to always point out. So impressive that they could work in all of these scripts and different languages. But they focused their attention on Demotic Egyptian because, as I said earlier, that had become the script in which religious texts were written at this period. And so they were very cognizant that they were participating in rites at an Egyptian temple, and that they that this was the appropriate language to make those inscriptions in. Meroitic seems more to be a language used by political figures who came as emissaries on behalf of the ruler in Meroe. And so there's a room now on the east side of the temple, this behind the second eastern colonnade, this sort of interior courtyard called the Meroitic Chamber that had a long text and image inscription, if you will, on 3 of the 4 walls of this chamber. And so that language seems to be one used by Meroitic diplomats coming to negotiate with the then Roman rulers of Egypt. And then finally, Greek is used. Only 2 Greek language inscriptions on this Gate of Hadrian that I mentioned were inscribed by 2 of the highest ranking Meroitic emissaries. And so they used Greek because that was the international language at that time. That was the language that they needed to employ to negotiate with the Roman rulers of Egypt, who never introduced Latin. They just continued to rule Egypt using the Greek language of the Macedonian predecessors. But in the third period, which I said I wouldn't talk about too much, since the kingdom of Meroe fell in 330 CE, Greek then becomes the language also used in Nubia. So 2 different groups who didn't really engage a lot in writing used the Greek language to communicate with each other, and it becomes the lingua franca of Nubia for some centuries in this gap after the kingdom of Meroe fell.
Thank you. What kinds of things do the inscriptions record?
I'll talk mostly about the Demotic inscriptions because they are far and away the most prominent, especially in this middle phase in the 3rd century CE. And what they record is very dramatic piety. The Nubian inscriptions are known for being much more heartfelt, longer, much more reverent toward the goddess Isis. And so that's the reason why the longest Demotic inscription known in Egypt was written by one of these Nubian ambassadors from Meroe. Yeah, his inscription, again, was written on the exterior of this Gate of Hadrian. So you'll understand that this was one of these primary focal points for Nubian worship. But they would say, I'm bending my arm to you, Isis. I'm calling out to you. And so that's why I use that phrase as the title for my book. They repeat this Demotic verb shalel that we don't see used by any other ethnic groups in their inscriptions at Philae. This is something that the Nubians say, I'm calling out to you. And so I believe that they not only had their prayers inscribed, but they recited them aloud before certain images on the wall of the temple, and probably also divine statues that would have stood in this particular southwest corner of the Pronaos. They also record how their journey from Meroe was. They ask her as a helper goddess to protect them, to give them favor before the king in Meroe. And many of them record how they gild this divine statue annually. And in fact, Sasan, the author of that longest demotic graffito, who is ambassador of the king of Meroe to Rome, he says, and we can understand Rome and Egypt, talks about pounds and pounds of gold that he's bringing, sent by the king in Meroe to donate at Philae. And so some are given directly to the Egyptian priest, some are used to make cultic ornaments and made right there at Philae. So there's record of Nubian goldsmiths who travel with as part of the entourage. But then they also are coming annually to gild, to make new these divine statues of Isis and Osiris at the temple of Philae.
That's fascinating. It sounds like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like these ambassadors, though they're on an official mission from their king, it was also personally important to them to leave these inscriptions.
Absolutely. So it's part official negotiations, but Sasan, again, in this longest graffito, talks about how he also gives a specified amount of gold from his poverty, I think, is how we translate it. I don't know if that's exactly right, but he's making clear to say, I too give from my own personal stash this amount of gold to the goddess Isis.
That's fascinating. Thank you. So do the inscriptions in the graffito tell us a lot about Nubian religion, simply Nubian interaction with Egyptian religion? And is there even a distinction to be made there, or is that a much more modern set of designations that we probably shouldn't be using?
Yeah. So I think we can distinguish between the two, because there are sort of there are differences in the ways, the things that are emphasized, the gods and goddesses that are worshipped. One thing that is shared is this reverence for Isis and her deceased spouse, Osiris. Yes. So, Megan, can you tell me the first part of that question again? I just lost my train of thought.
What can you tell anything about Nubian religion specifically from the inscriptions in graffito?
Okay, so what I allude to in my book, and then I really hammer home in an article in Near Eastern Archaeology from 2019, is that this rite of pouring milk libations that the Nubian priests seem to be coming specifically to do. They're going to get the divine statue of Isis, gild it with gold, transport it over to Biga Island, and there they're going to find 365 separate offering tables at which it has been decreed that libations of milk should be poured out for Osiris. And this theology is developed throughout the temple complex at Philae about how these milk libations will be an integral part of the rite to revivify, resurrect, if you will, the god Osiris, so that he can become Wen Nefer, beautiful of being. And I suggest that these milk libations are a Nubian rite that is introduced into the temple practice here at Philae. There is a text called the Abaton Decree on the north interior wall of this Gate of Hadrian that shows the god Thoth, so the god of writing in ancient Egypt, like this, with his pen right next to a very long hieroglyphic text that records a decree of the sun god Ra, who says that these libations must be poured for Osiris every single day in these 365 offering tables. And so it looks like when you just look at the Temple of Philae, you see Egyptian gods making this decree. In the pronaos of the main temple, you see Ptolemy VIII pouring a milk libation, and then clustered around it Nubian inscriptions. And so one would be justified in thinking that this is an Egyptian rite. But the thing is, it doesn't appear anywhere north of Philae. And it does appear in temples throughout Nubia. And the first instance of this is from the Temple of Dhaka at the sanctuary built by that Meroitic king Arkamani II. And so, although they work together as colleagues, the inscriptions record the honors done for these Nubian priests by the Egyptian priest resident at Philae upon arrival, and how they work together. They do seem to come from different religious traditions that find a shared purpose in the reverence of Isis and Osiris.
That's very interesting. And I listened, there's a lecture, for those of you who don't know, there's a lecture on YouTube that Dr. Ashby gave a few weeks ago for Everyday Orientalism on this material. And you talk some about the interaction between the Christian and the traditional priests in later time periods, which sounds like a completely different relationship to the Nubian and the Egyptian priests that you're describing here.
Yes, very different. In that phase 3, we start to see inscriptions up on temple roofs. So on the roof of the main temple, and then on the roof of the birth house in front of the main temple. And it seems that these traditional priests are having to retreat to kind of almost hiding places, because in that same pronaos where all of this Nubian activity had been happening in the 3rd century, there is established a Christian altar on the east side of the pronaos, and they seem to have created an early Christian church in the pronaos before later building Christian churches also on the island of Philae.
Thank you. So my final question, does the Nubian presence at Philae represent primarily the activity of the elites, or can you make an argument for a wider cross-section of society having access to the temple space?
This is a really interesting question. So, of course, the people who are leaving inscriptions are the elite, and they're men. They're uniquely men. But what they do say in their own inscriptions is, one man says, "I'm performing these rites before my daughter." And so we know that her presence was worthy of being noted in this prayer inscription. Sasan tells us that he's giving gold to the daughters of the Egyptian priests at Philae. And then several other inscriptions talk about asking Isis to keep safe and protect the writer's mother, and also make note of, "I'm here with all of the people who belong to me." So literally, that's a kind of a stodgy Egyptian way of just saying, "I'm here with my people." And so we can understand from the Nubian inscriptions that this society was organized around extended family groups, and that the Nubian people came to Philae as a community. And so they arrived en masse. There would have been the elites who were officials in the employ of the Meroitic king and priests, but they would have also brought their community with them. And Sasan, again, tells us how the Meroitic king sent money specifically earmarked that they will throw an epic party on the forecourt of the temple. So this would have been the only place that common people could be. They would never have been allowed into the temple, but that the Meroitic king sent some pounds of gold to fund an 8-day party that was meant to include everyone from the district. So the entire area around the Temple of Philae. So yes, it was nobility, but also common people took part in sort of the party aspect of the Nubian visit to this temple.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Everybody, we are going to take a very brief 60-second break. So if you have a question for Dr. Ashby, please do put it in the side chat of whatever platform you're watching on, and we will get back to you very shortly. If you'd like an expert to answer your questions, then make sure you join us live next time. Check out digitalhammurabi.com/calendar for details of future interviews. And remember to bring your questions. Hello again, everybody. Welcome back. We have a good number of questions, so we'll get dug into those. Someone is asking about Nubian writing, whether they used Egyptian writing or if they had their own system.
This is a great question. So the Nubians were not big on writing at all. They had much more of an oral culture, much more of a communal religious practice, and were not big on monumental temple construction and religious text. And so Egypt colonized Nubia from about 1500 BCE to about 1000 BCE. And during this period, we see Nubians adopting Egyptian hieroglyphic script. And so there are stelae and funerary monuments that incorporate Egyptian hieroglyphs during this Napatan period that the Egypt's 25th dynasty, those Kushite rulers, come out of. So that's about 900 to 300 BCE that we have Nubians using Egyptian script. But right around 200 BCE, we have the Meroitic kingdom creating their own indigenous script. And so this is the first time that we have Nubians writing in their own language. I do want to hearken back to what I said earlier about these triliterate priests. So it's not that people are unable to write. It is not important for the way that they conducted their culture. But in the Meroitic period, we have two scripts developed based off of Egyptian scripts. So they're Meroitic hieroglyphs, clearly using Egyptian hieroglyphs, but in a very different way. They are developing an alphabetic script. And so it's much simplified from what the Egyptians did, and this is an advance, I think. And then we have the much more prominent Meroitic cursive script that's developed directly out of the Demotic script, again using symbols, but to write frequently very different sounds. And all of the inscriptions that I referred to as Meroitic at Philae and even a temple further south called Dhaka are written in this Meroitic cursive script.
And how much do we know about the Meroitic language?
It's we still can't read it. That's kind of the sad part. A scholar named Griffith was able to crack the code. And so now we know what sounds the letters are meant to record. He did that, I think, in 1911, and we've not made a whole lot of progress
Oh, wow.
since
Okay.
then. But we do know that the Meroitic language, and probably all of the language spoken by all of the Kushite rulers, perhaps all the way back to Kerma, was a language that belongs to the Nilo-Saharan language group. So it's a completely different language family than Egyptian, which belongs to Afro-Asiatic language group. So just a very different language, which is part of the reason why scholars are having such a hard time being able to translate it. But it is related to languages like Maasai all the way down in Kenya, like Nara, that is a group currently living in Eritrea, and other groups in the area that is now Darfur. And the modern Nubian languages, I should add. These are all Northeast Sudanic, from the Northeast Sudanic subfamily of the Nilo-Saharan language family.
Thank you very much. We had a super chat from Amiganuts for $20. Thank you very much. I like your picture. It is a penguin wearing a helmet.
Okay.
It's not to love about that. Next question. How much did Nubia influence Egypt? Can we identify ancient myths and gods that migrated north to Egypt, or traditional culture that migrated south from Egypt to Nubia?
There was a lot of sharing between these two groups. I feel like that is always the focus of any scholarly writing that I am doing, is identifying a Nubian presence in what we have traditionally understood to just be Egyptians. So I talk about Nubian queens of the Middle Kingdom ruler Mentuhotep II. They were priestesses of Hathor. There again, that very early 2000 BCE connection with the goddess Hathor. I am now writing an article about Nubian magicians who are described in this Egyptian tale called Setna II. I should just backtrack and say, before people even settled in the Nile Valley, we had a larger migratory population of cattle pastoralists living in what was then the Green Sahara. But when that started to dry up between 8,000 and 5,000 BCE, we had that group of people moving to the Nile Valley in search of water for their herds. And it is this same group that ended up living in Nubia and in Egypt. And so they have this common origin and history. So there's a lot of shared culture just from that prehistoric period, but there's also, of course, always entanglement. And so during this 500 years of Egyptian colonization of Nubia during the New Kingdom, we have the introduction of Egyptian gods and goddesses, or their syncretism with indigenous Nubian gods and goddesses. So Amun is a really good example. We have Amun of Thebes, who was the main god of these 18th dynasty New Kingdom rulers. But then we also have Amun as worshipped at the sacred site of Jebel Barkal in Nubia, at the Fourth Cataract. And he is depicted with a ram's head, which seems to be a Nubian innovation, and tying into an indigenous ram god who was always worshipped there well before the Egyptians showed up. So it's this kind of cultural entanglement, as Stuart Tyson Smith likes to call it, that I find so interesting to talk about, that the two cultures very much had a give and take. And what I'm deconstructing in this most recent publication is that the official language of Egyptian demeaning and disparaging their Nubian neighbors is only that. It's something like a kind of make America great again kind of cultural arrogance that doesn't reflect the lived reality of Egyptians and Nubians being neighbors, and intermarrying and sharing culture and religious practices. When you dig just a little bit deeper than this sort of royal bravado, we see people who have been interacting for millennia.
Thank you. So someone is asking, based on their reverence towards Isis, was that based on their own personal faith, or were they just being respectful towards their neighbor's goddess? Essentially, was it a diplomatic and commercial move rather than actual heartfelt piety?
I think in Nile Valley antiquity, it's kind of all of the above, right? That everything has a veneer of religion, but it's also international relations, it's trade, it's what is the sort of the common language that we can come together and interact with each other. And so, as far as I know at this point, and I still leave a question mark, Isis and Osiris are Egyptian deities that were adopted by the Kushites and then, of course, transformed into their own Nubian version of these gods, of this god and goddess. And they seem to have, Isis and Osiris, a kind of restricted use in the Kushite context. They're very much associated with funerary rites, and incorporated into royal funerary rites for deceased rulers. It doesn't seem to permeate down into non-royal communities that much. They are much more focused on indigenous and local gods. So Arns-Nufus and Mondelez, who I mentioned, up in the northern part of Nubia, and then gods and goddesses like the lion-headed Apetamak or the goddess Amasemi. And so there's just a great variety of deities worship. We see the Kushites adopting these Egyptian gods, but also maintaining their own indigenous practices.
So those are all the questions for the audience, but I'm going to be sneaky and slip one more of my own in. What do we know about indigenous Nubian religion?
Yes, so it is quite different from what's going on in Egypt, and of course we see a prominence given to indigenous gods in this Meroitic period, 300 BCE to 300 CE. So Apetamak, this lion-headed god, is all of a sudden depicted on temples at Naka specifically. And Amasemi as well, this indigenous goddess who wears a crescent moon on her head and then a falcon standing in that moon with a solar disk on the falcon's head. The problem with this is, since we can't read the Meroitic script, it's hard to say a whole lot about what these deities meant to the people who worship them. We do know that Apetamak, that lion-headed god, was understood as a creator god, and his name includes Mak, which means God in the Meroitic language. Amasemi, I think we know a lot less about. I would say for folks that you should look forward to the dissertation published by my sister scholar, Deborah Hurd from University of Chicago. She's writing about the Amun and Apetamak temples in Kush, and I hope will give us a deeper understanding of these gods. What I found when I was writing about Meroe, just to sort of understand the backstory of these Nubian kings, is that the prominence of women, the sacred female divine, is really important. and that she is depicted often holding a sistrum, so a rattle sacred to the goddess Hathor. So you just hearing Hathor mentioned, and pouring a libation. And there seems always to be a goddess with her wings unfurled, probably Isis, although not 100% sure. And then behind that goddess, probably a Meroitic royal, well, certainly a Meroitic royal woman, perhaps the queen, but perhaps the Kandaka, who is the queen mother in Meroe. And so I love that this culture has such an important place for the divine female.
It sounds like there's a lot of really exciting work still left to be done, and it's just really nice to hear about people actually doing it. It's very exciting.
Yes, I have to say the Qataris have put a lot of money toward funding various excavation sites in Sudan. So there's an amazing amount of excavation being done. And so we are, by the day and week and month, learning more and more about this ancient civilization. So it is one to keep your eye on.
Fantastic. Well, we will end things there. Dr. Ashby, thank you so much for joining us. This was absolutely fascinating. Thank you, everybody, for bringing your questions. And until next time, resist for scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?
Amen.
Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/Digital Hammurabi to see how you can help.